All right, can you guys see my screen? All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Climate Change and Invasive Species, a conversation with Curt Stager and Brian Greene. My name is Sean Kittle. I am the communications coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have this morning, and I really appreciate all of you joining us. Oopsie. One too far. Okay, so today's agenda, pretty straightforward. We're going to start with Curt Stager. As many of you probably know, he is an ecologist, paleoclimatologist, science journalist, and professor at Paul Smith College. And Curt's going to give us a bit of a personal note about his observations and research on climate change. He's going to talk about what science tells us about climate change in the Adirondacks and beyond. And then he's going to get into a bit about how climate change could cause people to seek refuge in places like the Adirondacks. After Curt, we're going to let Brian Greene speak for a little bit. He is the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And Brian's going to give us an overview on invasive species in the Adirondacks. He's going to talk about how invasive species are transported and how a milder Adirondack climate is more favorable to invasive species. After that, I'm going to give a little shout out, a little preview to some upcoming APIPP events, including one that's happening tomorrow. It's a field training in Wilmington, and then we're going to have a discussion and a Q&A. And I'll remind everyone of this a little bit later, but during the discussion and Q&A, we're kind of going to do a combination. If you'd like to type questions or comments into the chat, you're welcome to do so. You can also use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we can call on you. We have a lot of people here, so we're just going to try to keep it orderly so people aren't talking all at the same time. All right, thanks. And Brian or Curt, you're up.
Great. Let me get my acting together here. Okay, can everybody see the picture here, Ice Palace?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so welcome everybody on this nice warm February day. It's very fitting, sad to say. So I'll give you some background for the next 15-20 minutes on what we know about how the climate is changing here in the Adirondacks and some of what it means. So I'll just get right into it. I'll get this to advance. Yeah. So we know it's warming here. There's no question about that. As we combine these three records here on the aerial view of the Adirondacks here, the 3 stars are 3 weather stations. The one near the top is in Dannemora. The one over to the left there is Tupper Lake, and the lower one is Indian Lake. So if you combine the weather records from those 3 and just get one curve, you see what's over here on the left. So it's a 120-ish year record. And if you read it from left to right, you have this bouncy thing here of the temperatures, and temperatures, of course, would be higher going up. So it bounces around a lot. That's normal, but the overall trend is upwards. So I put a general trend line through that, and it's actually faster than the global average over the last century, what's been happening here. And if you look at the last half century or so, it's accelerated too. So this really does bring home the reality that global warming is not just some remote thing. It's happening here. And when we talk about global warming, we're talking about a global average. And of course, the average just means that individual places could be warming faster or slower. And in our case, we're warming faster. And if you want, we can get into that, why that might be. It probably has to do with our position on the planet. The higher latitudes are warming faster for various reasons, and we're part of that. So the bottom line of what's happening is the year as a whole is warming, and the way we experience that on the ground is especially over the last half century, we've been getting shorter, milder winters and longer, hotter summers. But different times of the year are warming at different rates. And as we'll see, actually spring is not warming as fast as the other times of year. But we see signs of this even without thermometers and charts of temperatures bouncing up and down. We see it all around us if we pay attention to the landscape, especially around wintertime. So here's a photo from Lake Champlain with the ice fishing shanties on it. And some of you may remember what I remember from the 1980s, that there used to be ice fishing between Burlington and Plattsburgh, entire villages of these ice shanties. And then it was always entertaining in the spring when the thaw came and the ice was going out, and some people who were too late getting their stuff off the ice would get stranded as a big iceberg floated off with them into the middle of the lake and then have to be rescued. We don't see those headlines anymore. And that's because the main body of Lake Champlain between Plattsburgh and Burlington rarely freezes over. So I've simplified an ice cover chart here on the bottom, going back 200 years. With a little, if you read it from left to right, from the early 1800s up to about the present day, each little asterisk is a winter in which that main basin didn't freeze completely. So through the entire 1800s, there were 3 winters where it didn't freeze. And as you go to the right, it becomes more and more common not to freeze. So I haven't been down there recently, but I pretty much guarantee, and some of you may confirm, that the lake is open right now. So at Paul Smith's College, we keep our eyes on these things too. Like a lot of people in the region, I've kept just a personal nature diary for years, and I lived on the campus for a long time. And so I would write down when the robins show up in spring, when the red maples open up, when the spotted salamanders migrate on the road, and we go out with the students to watch them. And over time, what started as a hobby became a long-term data set, which I know some of you in the group here, Neil Gifford does this, Larry Master, others have just kept track of how things change through time. And now this is a formal thing. We've actually marked out on the campus where the standard observation points are for the red maples, the robins, the ground dwelling bees when they come out in the spring. And we built this into a class that I'm teaching now called The Science of Climate Change. So we have more than 30 years of records now of not only the temperatures, but what are the responses of the animals and plants. And we published it recently in the journal PLOS Climate, if you want to look that up, came out last year. The bottom line is, as you might expect, in winters when it's warmer, the animals and plants do what they do earlier. The robins arrive earlier, the plants open up earlier, the spotted salamanders migrate earlier. So they're definitely sensitive to the temperature. As it turns out, the spring has not been warming as rapidly as the other parts of the year in the last 30 years. So not all of the animals and plants are showing a trend, but they all show a strong sensitivity. So the takeaway message there is when this spring starts to catch up with the rest of the seasons, as it will inevitably do, we can predict that it's going to have very strong influences on the animals and plants who live here. So as I said, other times of year it is warming, and especially in September and December is another month where there's very intense warming. And so we've also built long-term monitoring into our introductory biology program at the college. And here we are at the lake next to the campus with a bunch of introductory biology students out collecting plankton and measuring the temperature of the lake. And they've been doing that for more than 30 years, and we've kept those data as well. It's built right into the class. And when we have the students then add their data to the long-term set and analyze the data, we find out that sure enough, as September and October have warmed up in terms of climate, the lake itself has warmed a lot too. Here it's 3.5 degrees since we started taking these measurements. That has profound impacts on the ecology of the lake, and of course also sets the stage for invasive species to show up and maybe succeed in the habitat where earlier on they might not have been able to make it. So if we ask ourselves what's next, it's pretty obvious. The more fossil fuels we burn and the more heat trapping greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the warmer it's going to get. So right now we're making those kinds of decisions as to what the world's going to be like. But again, this trend that we've been seeing so far will continue. And so if you take here, I sort of try to visualize where you say, okay, here's the year, you got about half of it's summer and half of it's winter here. And in the future, there'll be more summer and it'll be hotter, and there'll be less winter and it'll be milder. And then it will all depend on us, how extreme those changes become. So for this research paper in Close Climate, I took the results of a study that Mary Thill and I did for some of you folks at the Nature Conservancy here, where we took 16 global climate models and downscaled them to the Champlain Adirondack Basin there and projected ahead to what we should see by the end of the century. So what I've got here is the results of that. Here's a curve of the temperatures during the year nowadays. So if you read it from left to right, this curve goes up and up. Those are temperatures going up in the spring into the summer, and then it starts to cool off again through the fall and then down into the winter. And we get, sub-zero centigrade stuff once in a while. So I just colored in winter here. This is deep winter where you do get the real cold. But here's what it's projected to look like on the track that we're on. So I'm going to flip back. Look at that blue spot, right? That's deeper cold in the middle of, February, March, and all that kind of. Now just keep your eye on it right there. And that's what it looks like near the end, like in about 50 years on the track that we're on. So what that means is no deep cold and much shorter winter in here too. Basically, the bulk of things have gone into the summer, and we'll get back to that later. But it's basically what we're watching here is during this century, we're watching the vanishing of winter as we know it. So maybe to step back from that and take the big picture, what does that mean? Well, in terms of climate anyway, and the setting for species who are living here or ones that may be coming in, one way to put it is the Adirondacks are becoming more like the Blue Ridge. And as I was writing this paper with my colleagues, summarizing these 30 years of data and the weather records and looking ahead to the future, it really hit me on an emotional level, because I was talking about the animals and plants and the lake ice and things like that. And then I started realizing that the human story is embedded in this too. We're connected to the land. And although the Blue Ridge is a beautiful place, and I used to live down there, and it's got the mountains like we do, but it's not the Adirondacks. And it's become clearer and clearer to me, and other folks too, I'm sure, is that where we live defines who we are. And winter above any other season is what defines the Adirondacks. And so that's something to think about, is the human ecology, you could say, of this. So our identity is wrapped up in winter here. Here in the Tri-Lakes area, we talk about the 2 Winter Olympic Games we've had here, and we just had the World University Games. And of course, we've got the economic ties to that too. We've got the 100 years of winter carnivals, more than 100 years in Saranac Lake. We've got the snowmobiling mecca in Old Forge. That depends on deep cold, which is going away. And so this year is an anomaly. This will probably go down in the record books. It's probably going to flip back to cooler winters, off and on going forward. But what we're seeing this winter is what the future looks like. And you could see it here with the ice palace. These are folks just a few weeks ago cutting ice there. And there's Lake Flower in the background, and here they're picking up the blocks to make the ice palace. That block there is 9 inches thick. The people I talk to who do this cutting say normally, or what they preferred, was 12 inches. And as you can see here, the ice looks pretty thin down in here too, right? Well, that has consequences, of course. I'll show you a picture of what the ice palace looks like right now. But in light of this, I collected a weather record from Dannemora with daily temperatures going back more than 100 years. And I plucked out the coldest days I could find in the record. And I said, okay, I'm going to put a dot on this timeline for the number of days in any particular year where the temperature fell to minus 20 or below in Fahrenheit. And so the way to read this is the higher the dot is on this chart, the more cold, super cold, deep cold days there were during the year. So it's not a temperature thing, it's number of days. So in other words, because all these dots up here are pretty high and there's a lot of them, it means there were lots of minus 20 and colder days earlier in the century. And this trend line is dropping until you look at this bottom line here, and it looks like the Lake Champlain ice record. These dots down on the line here are winters when we did not get temperatures of minus 20 or less. And as far as this year looks, which isn't on the chart yet, so far we've had only one. So it's not meant to be a pun, but it chilled me watching this line drop off pretty consistently. It fits with the temperatures and the computer models. If you run this down to zero, down to the zero line when there are no more super colds, it's about in the 2080s. And that's just what the computer models are saying too. So what we're looking like is maybe a half century or more of ice palaces for our winter carnival. So that's pretty sobering for me. This is what the ice palace looked like at the end of winter carnival. There's our 2023 sign, and it melted off. And these are thin blocks, right? There's less to start with, and then it was warm, and then it rained, and this is what it looks like. So it sort of, to me, symbolized the big picture of what's going on here as we lose winter. So to bring this back to invasive species, of course, there will always be winners or losers in any major environmental change. So as winter is becoming milder, deer have an easier time surviving milder winters, so it could increase the deer population. But of course, if deer have deer ticks with their wonderful diseases they carry, then we're also making it more favorable for ticks. They could all feel like winners, but we might feel like losers then, getting more of that up here in the high country. So to come back to this thing about winter going away, that's only half the year. The other half of the year is what's happening in summer. That's the flip side of it. And here is what's been will be added to our summers later in the century. So these are longer, hotter summers. And again, you can make the list. Some of you here, you know your species of animals and plants, you know what that can mean. And we'll hear more of that from Brian Greene in just a minute. But again, as I was thinking of the human story and in thinking of it in the context of invasive species, it really struck me that the biggest vector of spreading invasive species that we happen not to like is humans. They're all here because people have moved around, right? Well, as the climate changes elsewhere in the country, people are going to be moving around more. And we've seen that not just with COVID, but when it's a super hot summer and it's intolerable, not only from the temperatures, but the poor air quality in these major cities, where do you go? You go up into the high country where it's cooler. And we're seeing the crowding. COVID kind of gave us a glimpse of where we're headed in here, but with the greater influx of people coming in a sense, you could call them climate refugees. And when we say that, we tend to think of impoverished people maybe showing up, fleeing in a boat and whatever. But my concern here for us is wealthy climate refugees, not fleeing under duress, but leaving because they can and they can afford to. Coming from not only the hotter cities down here, but out in the Southwest, where the trends are clearly getting drier and hotter, more wildfires, cities running out of water. And so that has massive impacts. More people coming in, bringing in more invasive species, but also further challenging our culture here. And those of you that live here have seen this, right? We have a major housing crisis where people can't afford to live here. And of course, that means there's no one to do the service economy that wealthy immigrants are bringing in and buying up the properties and then making short-term rentals that local folks can't live in. So I'm looking ahead to the climate changes will certainly have big effects on the critters and the plants, but it's going to affect us too, because we're part of this ecosystem. And that will have knockoff effects also back again on the invasive species. And I know it's depressing, but I think we need to look at this and plan ahead for these kinds of challenges. And I'll add to this that as this place continues to have land values go up, wealthy people who don't bat an eye at those prices will be seeing this and want to develop it more. And it just seems like common sense that the protections we now have in the park are going to be challenged by people with the money who would like to see it open to them to develop and become more wealthy. So I think we shouldn't take for granted the protections and the regulations we have. I think they're going to be attacked more strongly than ever as climate change goes on. So I'll close here with just 2 slides. One is with all that doom and gloom, it's important to remember it's not a time to curl up in a ball and just say, oh, everything is lost. It's not. Now is when we make the decisions. The big picture solution is to switch as quickly as possible from fossil fuels. And there are a million reasons to do that. There's a lot of money going into denying that it's possible or that it's worthwhile, but it absolutely is. And we should ignore those kinds of claims. And there's a lot of money to be made from it too, right? So there's every reason in the world to make these switches as quickly as we can. The sooner we do that, the less severe these changes are going to be. And the last thing is to remember that science is real. And we have this information. It doesn't have to be politicized. It's meant to serve all of humanity. We do have very good science showing us where we're headed. And in addition to a lot of people facing that reality, like I figure most of you are, there are a lot of people responding to that in creative ways. And I tell Peg this and others too with the Nature Conservancy. I love to tell the story of Follinsby Pond, where there's a large population of heritage lake trout living in this lake, and lake trout are in trouble all over North America because of climate change and other things. The Nature Conservancy is very careful about not only taking care of them, but planning ahead, knowing that it's going to get warmer, recognizing that for all the other great things there are about Follinsby, it's very deep. And it's got a deep cold water reservoir full of oxygen, which will buffer it against the effects of future warming. So this will be a lake trout refuge in the future. And the Nature Conservancy is taking that science and planning accordingly. And I think the more we do that kind of thing, as I hand it off to Brian here, the more we take this climate setting that we're in and build that into our plans for facing it and our management approaches. So I'd like to thank you for that. And I'll pass it off to Brian from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Curt. It is a great talk and a great honor for me to follow you. Now you'll see that you'll see some similarities in our talks, and Curt and Sean and I kind of coordinated some things, but I hadn't seen Curt's slides before then. So it's probably the similarities are probably more due that I'll embarrass Curt a little bit. Like he's actually one of my scientific heroes. I grew up reading him in National Geographic. I've read his books and different things. So this is a real honor for me to be able to share the screen with him. And you'll see some similarities that are probably imprinted from my years of reading him on there. So let me share my screen. Okay. Everybody can see this now. Give me a heads up, Sean.
You're good.
Okay. So like Curt said, we're going to kind of now shift it focus and look a little bit more closely on how climate change is going to impact invasive species in the North Country and in the Adirondacks. And, unfortunately, the punchline is this is going to really kind of be a double whammy. And we're really going to see that these are two synergetic things that are going to kind of feed off of each other, and they're going to cause some impacts that unfortunately we're going to have to learn to deal with. And so when we think about climate change, or you Google climate change, these are the types of images that we see or we come to mind first. Hurricanes, wildfires, sea level rise, glaciers falling apart. These are the images that we've been told, and that really are super scary, and things that many places are going to have to deal with. But if I was a betting person, and for the Adirondacks, I wouldn't be betting on these types of things that would be front and center. I would be betting a little bit more on things like this, these small plants and insects that are really going to be the impacts that we see. This is an example of hemlock woolly adelgid and Eurasian water milfoil, which I'll talk about. And I am definitely of the famous biologist E.O. Wilson's line of thinking that, they are the little things that run the earth. It is the plants and insects that really make all life possible. And these are the things that we're really going to have to start to watch out for. So I'm going to give a quick outline about invasive species, and then I'm going to talk about these 3 different scenarios where warming temperatures, sleeper species, and increased vigor is going to interact with invasive species here in the North Country. So invasive species in 30 seconds. If you hadn't heard about this, there's 2 things that make a species invasive. First, it has to be not native to a region and moved there by humans. So humans moving them through trade, like on boats, or through aquarium releases, or through our horticultural trade, or through pets. So they are moved there by a person. That's one factor that they have to have. And then the second factor is that they have to cause harm to the environment, economy, or public health. So there's a negative impact that they are having. And if you look at this little diagram on the right, it is kind of trying to illustrate that there's a range, a scale. So at the top of it is a picture of poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant to New York. And while people don't like it and it can cause people to get sick, it's native. It's been here for thousands of years. The next picture is a tomato. Tomatoes are not native to New York or the Adirondacks, but we know when they're introduced, we don't see them running wild and just growing rampant through our forests and getting loose in other places. So they don't have a negative impact. Well, then we have species like zebra mussels, which is a mussel species originally from Eurasia that was transported over in the ballast water of tanker ships to the Great Lakes, and then has spread throughout New York and spread throughout the United States. So this has huge environmental, ecological impacts of changing food webs, changing water quality. Millions of dollars are spent trying to prevent it, to remove it from pipes that it can clog, coating boats, coating pylons. So, and it can have negative impacts on health of some animal species. So this kind of gives you that range to think about invasive species. So remember, it's 2 things: not being native to a region, and it's causing negative impacts. So as Curt pointed out, we're going to have temperatures are going to warm here in the Adirondacks, and those warming temperatures are going to make some invasive species be able to move into these areas that they weren't able to habitat to live in before. First one we're going to talk about is hemlock woolly adelgid. And so if you see on this picture of a hemlock branch, you see all these little white sacs on it, and that is the woolly, almost like spider web mass that they make to kind of protect themselves. So over the winter, they can be protected from the cold, and then they're inside of there where they're able to feed on the plant, sucking out the sap from it. And so right now, if you go around, this is what you would see them. They kind of overwinter in this November until April stage. In the other parts of the year, they're a small nymph. Small thing. So you can see these little black dots, and kind of like poppy seeds. Some people might describe them, they're 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters across. They're very, very small, but these things can have incredibly large impacts in parts of the southern United States, in the Blue Ridge that Curt was talking about, in the Southern Appalachian, the Great Smoky Mountains, areas that get infested with hemlock woolly adelgid. the hemlocks have been dying off in 4 to 20 years because of this insect pest. So if we look at this map from IMAP Invasives, this is showing the current distribution of where hemlock woolly adelgid is. All these orange dots, and the bigger a dot is, the more there are in that area. So you can see the downstate area, New York City, Long Island, they have them, the central New York have them, but you kind of see this empty space in this hole around the Adirondacks and the North Country. And you just see this little finger kind of coming up, and that is the Lake George region where we recently found them and they've started to establish. Well, one of the reasons that we see this pattern, scientists say, is that there's a relationship to the cold weather. It is much colder in the Adirondacks in the North Country than it is down in the South. And they believe that there is a correlation with these really cold temperatures that prevent the hemlock woolly adelgid from being able to survive. If you think about it, we have lots of people traveling from these areas back and forth all the time, but they haven't been able to establish here. And that could be because the temperatures are too cold. Well, these are some slides that I took from Tamara that, from the Climate Central, looking at some climate data. It's showing the same pattern of the data that Curt was showing. So here's from Watertown, that over the past 50 years, we've got almost a 5-degree Fahrenheit increase in winter temperature. It's our winters that are getting much warmer. The number of warm winter days is now almost 2 weeks of days above normal temperatures in this area. And then nights below freezing are, about 8 fewer nights, a week fewer. And we recently had a symposium where we had experts from all across the country come and talk about hemlock woolly adelgid, and they showed this chart here where in this left column that's in the blues and reds is the probability of infestation for hemlock woolly adelgid, and the right column in the browns and green is the blues, and the greens are the percent of hemlock that is alive, and the brown is where it's dead. So in 2015, you can see, we didn't really have infestations of hemlock woolly adelgid up in the Adirondacks and in the North Country, but down in the southern parts, they were heavily infested. And most of our hemlocks, were doing well and alive. Well, you flash forward 2030, which is now only 7 years away, you see that the models are predicting that it will be, all kind of in this horseshoe area, kind of around the, the high part of the dome of the Adirondacks. And we'll still have some hemlocks, that'll be surviving, but where this line of high mortality is kind of creeping up to the southern edge. And then you go by 2050, the midpoint, only less than 30 years away. Almost all of the Adirondacks will be completely infested with hemlock woolly adelgid. And, besides the core of the Adirondacks, maybe the high parts of the dome that are still maybe getting some cold temperatures, there won't really be many more hemlocks alive without doing proper intervention and management to try to solve this. So this is an example of how with warming temperatures, a species can move into a new region and have a strong negative impact. And there's all sorts of cascading impacts on water quality, habitat, biodiversity, and other things that would come from losing such a keystone species as the hemlock tree in the Adirondacks. The next concept I'll talk about is sleeper species. So this graphic comes from the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change group. There's different subgroups all across the United States. They have great resources. When we send out our follow-up, we'll send a link to their website. So I took this graphic because it does a really good job of kind of explaining the concept. And this is there are some species that are already present in our region and in the Northeast, but invasive species, but they're not really causing very strong impacts yet. And so this example they give is kudzu. So it's in New England, but we don't really see any of the strong negative impacts of it yet because of limitations to it. And in this case, we believe it is temperature. It's just too cold for it to really thrive and really get out of control and cause a lot of problems. Well, you implement that climate change, and as the climate gets warmer, then that invasive species is awoken. And that sleeper species that was just there, not really causing an impact, we weren't really doing a lot to manage it. It can really start to run amok and cause a lot of problems for us. So I'll give you a local example from the aquatic. There is a species of submerged plant called fanwort, Bomba caroliniana, and it is currently in the Adirondacks. We have records of it in around 4 lakes in the very southern part, but it's not very widespread. I don't get a lot of calls from people seeing it or reporting it being a huge problem, and we're not spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to manage it. So it's there, but it hasn't really started to cause too much of an issue yet. Well, if you look at this map from the USGS that shows the orange is its native range down in Virginia, the Southeast, Florida, and then the dark brown is where it has invaded to. So Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, coming up the Hudson River right there, just so our southern Adirondacks. Well, like the research shows, our climate is going to warm. And this, looking at this map, kind of reminded me of another map that I saw when I was at the Echo Museum in Burlington. And if you can see over here, they were showing the change in what the Lake Champlain watershed, the weather was going to be like from, where it currently is when we think about it from, the 1960s to the 1990s. So then it's going to kind of currently now it's shifted down to more traditionally what was like the downstate, the Hudson River Valley. And then in the high emissions scenario, it could be like Virginia. The climate of our area around the mid-century will be like Virginia. Well, if you remember, that's the exact native habitat of fanwort. So as the temperature warms, as our climate changes, we are taking that species that's here right now, but not causing a huge problem. And it's going to be like where it grew up. And so it could start to become a much bigger problem here. And that's, that example that Curt gave of, the Adirondacks are shifting to be the Blue Ridge. And so that means, our species are going to have to change and adapt to that. And some of those species might be invasive species. And increased vigor. So this is Eurasian water milfoil. It is the most common aquatic invasive species in the Adirondacks. It's in over 65 different lakes. We have, we're spending, upwards of probably $1 million a year to try to manage this in our region. Lake associations are spending 10, 20, 50, 90, 100,000, $300,000 a year to try to remove this. So, I mean, this adds up to be real money because it has negative impacts on our ecology, grows really thick. It displaces the native species. It can change the plants and animals that are there, impacts recreation. So people aren't able to boat and swim in areas where these really dense beds are. And it can actually decrease property values. Studies from Vermont and Wisconsin have shown that lakes that are invaded have houses that sell for less than uninvaded lakes. So, there's a real economic impact of this species on there. And if you talk to limnologists and climate scientists, the biggest change that they will tell you with our lakes in the Adirondacks that is occurring is the temperature that is on them, and that they are getting much warmer, and that warmth is going longer. So here's a kind of hypothetical kind of example that I diagrammed that shows, our lakes start off cold in the wintertime, they warm up, and then they get colder again. And so the plants respond to that. Right now they're kind of low or dormant in the water, just waiting. But then as the season warms up, they grow taller, they start to reproduce and, get in resources. Well, so this is our historical pattern of what a lake temperature looks like. We have now increased it. And so now we've increased how warm it is, but we've also increased the length of the warm season. If you think about our Septembers and Octobers now in the Adirondacks, they are much warmer, and we see plants growing well later into the season than before. And so that allows the plants like Eurasian water milfoil to grow bigger and grow longer. And they're taking that and putting more resources into their roots and rhizomes, into their flowers and seeds, so that there's more of them. And it's showing that they are getting this competitive advantage over our native species. And so it's kind of this negative feedback cycle where the warmer temperatures create better habitat for the Eurasian water milfoil to grow. They grow bigger in the water columns. They put more resources. The next year they're able to grow bigger, to grow even bigger beds, which then can absorb more sunlight, which can warm up even more and, cause this this change that our native plants, can't keep up with. So those are kind of just 3 examples of how invasive species and the climate are going to interact, and I'm going to wrap it up with a story. So Lake Champlain and ice fishing, you saw this from Curt. It's an iconic thing. It's something that you have, and you get these great photos. And I saw this photo in a 2015 story by Susan May in the Lake Champlain region.com. And it really kind of struck a chord with me. And so I kind of wanted to share it. And I've even kind of researching this, saw that, there's been articles. There was an article in the New York Times from the 1890s that was written about people ice fishing on Lake Champlain. So, there's this really long history. So this is what Suzanne wrote. The village of Port Henry and the entire town of Mariah has a long history entwined with ice fishing. The wintertime activity is actually a part of the local culture and is taken very seriously. Record amounts of some of the most tasty smelt, locally referred to as ice fish, have been taken directly off their shores. Historically, the population of the town and village dramatically expanded during ice fishing season, as hundreds of hard water anglers flooded into town. This was great for the local businesses and the economy in general. Many local anglers would augment their income by selling their catch. Port Henry at one time was recognized as a major supplier of smelt to fine dining establishments in New York and Manhattan, where it was considered quite the delicacy. Huge ice cubes of smelt were packed in sawdust and loaded on southbound trains, tons of them, I am told. It was a social season. In past years, as soon as there was sufficient ice, clusters containing hundreds of shanties would pop up on the lake's frozen surface. These little villages had names: The Hole, Bryantville, East Channel, West Channel. Most often, the location of these clusters was determined by where the fish were biting, but sometimes a new addition of a community of cluster was more of a social thing. It was winter after all, and socializing is hindered by the harsh weather. This fishing season is used as an opportunity to get together with friends and family, all in close proximity. I'm certain that for some, it is not about the catch. For certain individuals, Henry David Thoreau's quote is most applicable. Many men go fishing all of their lives without knowing that it is not the fish they are after. And so I think this is just, a really great example that, here we have all these people, this great historic record, and they're out there looking for this rainbow smelt. Probably a fish that you haven't really heard about, that's native to Lake Champlain, and a small forage fish, really important for the feeding of bigger species like salmon and trout. But, people would use the fish for them and was considered a good eating and a delicacy. Well, this rainbow smelt is really getting hammered by this double whammy of invasive species and climate change. And here are those dual threats. The picture at the top is a rainbow smelt, but underneath it is an alewife. This is a non-native invasive fish that was been introduced to Lake Champlain, and it has reduced the population of rainbow trout in certain sections of the lake. That's because they have to occupy the same niche and they're competing for the same food. And then in those areas, the alewife has started to outcompete the rainbow smelt. And so now there's more alewife and less smelt. Well, that's bad for the people who are trying to fish for it, but it's also bad for many of the big sport fish like salmon and trout, because there's some issues with nutrients with the alewife that really prevent the growth and prosperity of these larger fish. So that's one threat. The other threat that I think is really that Curt talked about, and here's just a different way to show it, beautifully illustrated by Michaela Glennon, one of Curt's colleagues at Paul Smith's in the Adirondack watershed. And so this is part of their Wool and Water series. So that same chart that Curt showed, this is it shown as a scarf. So as you see on the left side of the scarf, the blue lines indicate when the lake did not freeze over the main body. And so in the 1800s, very few. But then as we get to today, you see it's more and more blue, where it's very rare that the lake will freeze over. So you might say, well, I don't go ice fishing. I don't catch smelt. I'm not eating smelt. But what do I really care? This is a little change, to me. And I don't think of it so much as, the smelt or those things, but I look out at this picture and I think about all the stories all the people out there, the laughing, the fun, the camaraderie, the money that they're spending in the local communities. And that is really what, Curt and I are talking about. It's this culture that we're losing. It's us that's going to be most affected and impacted, and that our way of life is changing. And, it's tragic to say, but in the last week on Lake Champlain, there's been 3 people who have died through falling through thin ice, and they've had to cancel ice fishing tournaments that have been going on for over four decades. And, that's really sad. We are losing out on these things that are really important to us. And so, like Curt, I don't want to leave you on that, pessimistic note, but to say, well, there is a good news about it. And the good news is that, we are the problem. We are moving invasive species about. We are the ones burning fossil fuels and putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But that also means that we can be the solution. So we can take steps to reduce our carbon impacts. We can take proper steps like clean, drain, dry all of our boats, not moving firewood from place to place, making sure that we are wiping off our boots or our mountain bikes after we go hiking and biking, so we're not spreading invasive species around. So we really hope that you join us, and we'll take the next steps to do there. Some of the things that, if you're super motivated in hearing this, we have some of these hemlock woolly adelgid field trips coming up. So you can join APIPP as a forest pest hunter, where you get trained on how to identify hemlock woolly adelgid, and then you go out and adopt an area, and you are able to survey it to see if hemlock woolly adelgid is present, and that's become part of our early detection system. Also on March 15th, we're going to having another webinar where we're talking about plants, pollinators, and pests. So one of the key things you can do is try to plant native things at your house and in your garden. And so we're not planting non-native species that can become invasive with there. So go to our website, adkinvasives.com, and you will be able to see some of these under the events page or find out more information. And so with that, we want to say thank you and really open it up for a discussion. And so if you have some comments, you can write them in the chat, or you can use the reaction to raise your hand, and we'll try to call on people to ask a question or just share a story with Curt and I.
Hey, Brian, do you want to go into full view mode so people can see each other? That might be kind of nice. And just a real quick add on to the plants and pollinators and pests webinar. We're going to have 3 speakers speaking for that. The first speaker is going to speak to the native connection between native people and native plants. I think that's going to be really cool. And then we're going to have another speaker get into the relationship between different pollinators and native plants and how invasive species can affect those relationships. And then lastly, we're going to get into, it's going to be kind of like a gardening landscaping kind of tutorial about some native plants that you can plant on your property to encourage those pollinators to thrive in our region. And I did put the registration link in the chat. So if you're interested, you can click on that, and there'll be more information about that on our events page in the next week or so. So there have been a couple questions already put in the chat, Brian and Curt. I have one that says, Curt and Brian, can you speak about potential for intentional accelerated migration / colonization of southern rarities in the Adirondacks in the future? Could the Adirondacks be a recipient for southern biodiversity at risk of extinction in the future? Interesting question.
Yeah, that's from Neil, right? Yeah. I would welcome Carner Blues up here any old time, if that's what you're talking about. But yeah, that's the flip side of this, right? Species moving around. And I'll admit I come at this whole topic from the straight up vanilla ice cream ecology side. So I usually avoid value statements like this species is desirable, undesirable, but absolutely, as the climate changes, places with elevation can be seen as not just a park, but an ark. And especially if they're protected like we are too, that's certainly something to consider, right? Neil, do you have any specifics that you know about, or maybe a story you could tell us about someone doing this? Oh, we'd have to unmute Neil Gifford if that's something. I don't see him on there.
Yep. Curt, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is something that we are currently working with on the federal carnival butterfly recovery team with Parks Canada.
Yeah.
And
So
looking
that's
at,
going to be a dilemma, right? We got to decide, what do you let in? What do you not do? It's sort of like human immigrants, right?
yeah, it's a huge ecological Pandora's box.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's the concept that we call the assisted migration, and which species do we move? We know that invasive species comes about from people moving them. And we have all these examples of people thinking that they're moving a plant or animal for some type of benefit, and then it gets out and causes problems. So yeah, it's going to be a really tough decision that we're going to have to make in the future. And there's going to need to be a lot of science, and there's going to be a lot of community community decision making, because it's not just, like Curt said, it's not just about the science, it's about our values and what species do we want to move and what species do we want to have.
All right, we have another question here. There's a little mini conversation that's been happening in the chat, Brian, while you were speaking. So yeah, could you please speak? We had a mini conversation in chat about definition of invasive species being organisms moved by humans. Neither of us have seen that included in the definition. Can you talk about it a little bit more?
Yeah, so invasive species, the key part is that they are moved there not on their own by a natural means. So, over long times, over millennium, plants and animals, will migrate or slowly move with climatic regimes. But now what's happened in our modern world is we can dramatically accelerate and transport that. So the zebra mussel is a great example. It was in the Black and Caspian seas. There's no way that a mussel in thousands of millenniums is going to be able to move from Eurasia all the way to the United States. The only way it was able to move there so quickly was because these giant tanker ships filled up with ballast water that had their young offspring and maybe even some adults in it, and then they came over the Great Lakes and they dumped all that water out. So in the 2 weeks that it took a boat to travel from Europe over to the Great Lakes, and all of a sudden now we have this new species. So plants and animals. But then the other point I saw some people making, once it gets here, then there are some species and things that can start to move on their own, like naturally. So the hemlock woolly adelgid is another good example. It was brought over from the West Coast to the East Coast, probably most likely in the ornamental plant trade, and then it started to spread naturally. So it's spreading from tree to tree. Birds are flying, they get on tree, they pick up some of these little nymphs, they fly 20-30 miles, and they could potentially spread it to another areas. And so once it makes that big jump over by humans, it does have the ability to do natural spread on their own.
Phil Reynolds has his hand up here. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks a million. I'm from Big Wolf Lake. Really concerned about these issues. We've been working with Brian and really appreciate their work. Just a quick dimension may or may not be of interest. I used to work for the United Nations and was involved in a program called Ballast Water Management, which was directly targeting the zebra mussel and the comb jellyfish, which we returned the favor to the Black Sea in our ballast water. So the convention, in a word, was developed by our experts, a convention saying what you do to control the spread of invasives in ballast. You use electrolysis, you use changing of water, and you can eliminate something like 80-90% of the invasives. It's great. It was a UN convention. We adopted it. Our Congress, Senate ratified it, and it becomes our law of the land, as it did in different countries. So there's an international way of dealing with some of these issues. Thanks.
And just so everyone knows, if you did put a question in the chat, I do have a document going with those questions in them, so we'll work through them. All right, so the next question, this one was in the chat. It says, stress, including pathogens, increases the number of trees that die. Dead trees are kindling for forest fires. Have we reached a point where we are now at increased risk of forest fires in the Adirondacks?
Yeah, as far as the direct climate effect, I think it's unlikely that the climatic changes are going to happen rapidly enough to cause mass die-offs. I think it's more likely, like we're talking the hemlock woolly adelgid. We actually had a precedent for that 5,000 years ago. There was a massive die-off of hemlocks in the eastern US, and we could tell from sediment cores and the pollen. And the frequency of forest fires would depend on whether it gets wetter or drier and hotter and all that too. And it's hard to predict that because it's definitely going to get hotter, but it's also been getting wetter here. So there's a trade-off, how much that will increase the fire danger. So I'd say maybe I'll shunt it over to Brian next, but my guess is if you were going to anticipate large stands of dead trees, it's going to come from invasives, not directly from the climate.
Yeah, I agree with Curt. Currently, you know, I don't think we are seeing those levels yet, but you know, that could be something that, you know, there's some areas around like the Lake George or Scroon watershed where you're seeing hemlock can be up to 70-80% of the forest. And so, you know, if those areas aren't able to be managed and we lose a large, that could be a severe threat. This is what we see out west with the pine beetles, that, you know, they've come in and the warming temperatures allows them to kill off a lot of the trees. And then it's just, you know, dead firewood just sitting there. And so when a fire happens, which is a natural phenomenon, now there's way more fuel and these fires are out of control. So hopefully this is not something we can see. We are a little bit, you know, of a wetter area and we're going to get increased water, but it's not out of the possibility.
Okay, we have another one from the chat. Can Brian or Curt please speak about clean energy communities?
I'm not an expert on that. And Brian, if you're not, maybe I'm guessing Mark himself might be able to talk about it. Brian, are you up on that topic?
I wouldn't call myself an expert on it, but you know, it's one of the things that, you know, we could talk that communities are doing. So, you know, we have to think about our responses on the federal, you know, state and local level. And I always try to encourage everybody to do the things at the local level. So, you know, we live in Saranac Lake. I believe we're, a bronze or a silver climate community. So, you know, there are steps that through programs that you can go through to try to make your community more climate friendly and more climate resilient. And we need to be taking as many of those steps as we can.
Yeah. So Mark, are you up on that? Do you want to give us a quick summary of what you were hoping we'd hear? Mark Danicore.
Well, I'm not super up on it. I understand that these programs exist in New York State and that some communities are taking advantage of them. And I understand if you, as a community, put some of these programs in place, that you'll obtain points, and then those points will eventually result in additional funding for you to continue your work to try to attack these issues that are affecting climate change. So it sounds like a great program. I'm just wondering if everybody's aware of it and if everybody's participating in it, because I imagine most people on this call believe in climate change and understand the impact of climate change, but I think we all need to do something to try to potentially reverse this problem. And it sounds like a great program to me. I just hope that people become aware of it, take advantage of it, and I'd like to do that in our community, as Brian said, it starts locally, and see what we can do there and get the word out to promote it. That's all I have.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
I'm going to skip ahead just because this is kind of a follow-up to the fire conversation that Brian just spoke about. Isn't fire devastation risk also dependent on the increased heat of fires in areas of denser undergrowth, not just standing or fallen dead trees?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of factors that go into that. So it like if you have the fire closer to the ground, you can burn the nutrients out of the soil and you can make these patinas on it that repel water, so you increase runoff. So yeah, fire ecology is a very complicated thing. If we don't have a big history of fires here, then if that ever did start to happen, then yeah, we'd have a transition time to a fire tolerant forest thing. So like, what was it, 100 years ago, right? There were a lot of fires from the trains going by and the charcoal industry. And we still have big groves of white birch, like in the Cascade Notch and places like that left over from that time period. But right now, the Adirondacks are not known as a frequent fireplace, except for something like the Pine Barrens up in the northern part of the park there, the Altona area. So yeah, this is all part of the equation, and ecosystems are complicated, and they're even more complicated when people are involved. So it's really hard to predict what will happen, but as you're noting, we can certainly see what might happen.
All right, we have a couple more here, and on the topic of prediction, if we are going to be like the Blue Ridge Mountains, what will the Blue Ridge look like? So we know what to expect in the late 21st century.
Yeah. I can take this, and then maybe if you want to add anything, Brian, but if you look at a map of the US, different regions are responding differently. So as you probably noticed in the news, the Southwest is really getting hammered, maybe the hardest of everybody. With it's basically what climate people would call a mega drought we're going into of historic proportions. We're losing winter, but the Southeast has had relatively mild changes for now. And so it actually is kind of ironic. It's sort of a hotbed of climate denial, you might say, down there too. And it's easy to see because they're not seeing the dramatic changes right where they live as much. So my guess is that as it warms, the Blue Ridge will not warm as fast as we are. It'll become maybe more like the Ozarks, the southern Ozarks a little bit. But the biggest ecological punch is going to be when you cross the temperature threshold of freezing of water, when you have snow and ice or you don't. And that transition we're going to go through. They've already been through it, really, right? They get a little bit of snow, but not a whole lot. So I would guess that they might not have as drastic changes in their near future as we would. I don't know if you want to add anything, Brian, on that. You can speculate on it.
We are, the thing I always say about climate change is it is this great unplanned experiment. We are changing the dials, and invasive species are the same way. It's like what would happen if we take this plant or animal from another continent and just throw it in with another one? Like, we have no idea. And so the only thing that history has showed us is that, unfortunately, it seems to be always the bad things. Like, we don't have invasive mangoes up here in the Adirondacks, and we're just all able to eat mangoes, all the time. It's always these nasty things that are causing us problems. So who knows? If the climate gets warm enough, maybe we will have mangoes up here. But yeah, so it's going to be hard to. The key thing that in the Nature Conservancy we're looking at is that Appalachians, that Blue Ridge Arboreal, we talk about it. The Appalachians are going to be a key corridor for plants and animals to move and migrate up, because they're going to be able to move both up and down in elevation, but then also north and south along there, that hopefully they'll be able to find a climate that is hospitable for them. So hopefully the Appalachians are going to be more resilient than other areas.
Yeah. So maybe just to pile on, to avoid the doom and gloom thing, we do have that going for us. Some of the key protected places just are protected because no one wanted to build on them that much. So we sort of have that advantage. I do want to add one thing though about the doom and gloom. I'd like to recommend a book for you if you're immersed in the climate change topic. It's by Michael Mann, a climate scientist, colleague, friend, spends time in the Adirondacks. He's been at the forefront not only of climate science, but also of being attacked by climate deniers, politicians, and others. This book is called The New Climate War. And basically, he's giving an update on where the climate denial machine is right now. It's all been academically, demonstrably traced to the fossil fuel industry, as you can well imagine. And as you maybe have noticed in headlines, Exxon and others knew about all of this decades ago, but hid it and also funded denial and stuff. Michael Mann explains that now the science for showing that the human caused global warming is real, it's so overwhelming that the strategy has now changed. It's harder and harder to deny the science. The strategy now, where the money is going from the fossil fuels to slow down regulations, is despair and infighting among environmentalists, liberals, and such like that. So flight shaming, saying, oh, you're eating too much meat, oh, this, oh, that, rather than focusing on switching from fossil fuels, and the despair industry. So again, like putting in posts in social media, I'm just off the cuff guess between a quarter and a third of the despairing stories you're hearing are aimed at you. They want you to feel like it's too late and everything is lost. It's not. And what we're saying, like, for example, we've got the park, we've got constitutional protections. We've more or less stopped acid rain. Things like that, we got to remember, keep our eye on the ball, not get caught in the doom and gloom. There is so much left to save, especially in places like the Adirondacks. We're a precious ark for the planet, and we got to look ahead and protect it and be proud of what we got and realize it's part of our identity too. So don't get sucked into the despair hole. Now's the time to get busy.
All right, if Curt and Brian have time, we have a couple more questions we have in the chat. And first, I just want to direct everyone's attention to the chat. Nick put a couple links in there regarding some like making your home more energy efficient and things like that. So I would just recommend everyone go check that out. Thanks for doing that, Nick. So one question we have here is, please speak about accelerating biomass creation and accumulation from native and invasive plants during longer growing seasons. What control or management steps are residents or organizations allowed and not allowed?
Take that, Brian.
Yeah, I can do that. Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. Depending on, is it private land, is it public land? There are different management techniques that are able to be done. But yeah, basically, you can have, too much, think of our knotweed, or honeysuckle, in our forest, growing super abundant and being in there, that'll change many of the aspects. So it has to be managed. And that either has to be done by a local private landowner or, collectively as a group. So, somebody before was asking about, where does the money come for, removing grazing water milfoil? Well, unfortunately, the vast majority of our aquatic management in the Adirondack is paid for at the local level. And, the same, local towns, lake associations, are paying for this. And, if you look, nationally across all invasive species, the amount of money being spent to deal with it is going up. And that is mainly at the local level, county, town. The example I like to give is, say emerald ash borer. If there's an ash tree, that's in the middle of, a big park, a preserve, a big forest, and it dies because of it, nobody really does anything. It just, it's probably just going to stand there till it just naturally falls down. But if that ash tree is in your little town's downtown park, then they're going to have to pay an arborist to come and take it down because they don't want it to fall on a building or fall on somebody. So, that's a good example of showing that the costs are mainly borne at the local level.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And Diane, you put a question in the chat about the definition of invasive species. Brian did reply to it there. So, if you have any more follow-ups, please let us know. The last question I'm seeing, and if I missed your question, I apologize. Please speak up. But the last one I have here is, and this, Brian, this will be for you. Has APIPP determined whether the Chinese mystery snail is considered an invasive species as defined by Brian?
The Chinese mystery snail is an invasive species, and so it is a non-native species that was moved here by humans, and it appears to be having impacts on our ecology. It can impact fish species. It eats their eggs. It can also change some of the native mussels and snail species. So it's having that. Now, once again, think of it as it's not like binary, like yes or no, it's like a range. So some of our invasive species, things like hemlock woolly adelgid, zebra mussels, emerald ash borer, wild pigs, or, brown tree snakes in Guam, they have huge mega impacts. Some other ones don't, they're still having impacts, but they're not as large. So it's kind of like, it's always kind of a scale that we're kind of looking at. So Chinese mystery snails, bandit mystery snails, they're not the worst one here, but they still do have impacts.
We do have a question. What about expanding current use? I'm not sure. Is that in relation to biomass, or it's from Suzanne?
Let me see. What's the
Or Susan? I'm sorry, Susan.
what about the expanding current use?
That's all it says.
Expanding. I'm not sure, Susan. If you want to come off mute and
mute me. There we go. So here's I've kind of forgotten all the statistical numbers, but I think 33 million acres of forest land are owned by private people in the state of New York. And there's what, about 6 million in Adirondack. So with current use, people can have, if you have a certain number of acres and you want to keep it just growing timber, growing carbon, you can get a property tax rebate. But it's not widespread, as I understand, in New York, and that could do a lot to store carbon. So Vermont just this last year changed their current use laws. It used to be that you had to have a forester write up a timber plan, and you had to resource some of your timber. And they've changed that if you want to have a natural forest to grow carbon, you can do that and get your tax break on your property, which is really big. So I think that's something we all want to work for in the Adirondack, for the state of New York. What do you think, Curt?
Yeah, I mean, carbon credits and things are definitely now in economic thinking with timber industry and landowners and things like that. That's all part of the puzzle, but always we got to remember to keep in mind the number one target is burning fossil fuels, because like you can, it's like the amount of carbon in the trees is an important factor, but there are many things that can happen. Like you can save it now, and then 10 years later, the forest burns, then it goes into the air, or you use it for timber, and then eventually the wood eventually rots and that CO2 goes back in the air. The biggest thing is the fossil fuels. So yes, we need to do all of this stuff, all of it. Yeah.
I'm very concerned also about rich people coming in. Vermont's got the same kind of housing pressure, and the state is actually pressuring towns to change their zoning and laws to allow more building. Yeah,
that's what we're going to see. So a sense of identity we think of as maybe a luxury or an entertainment. No, it's part of ecology. We are now a force of nature, and the way we think and act has consequences all over the planet and down through the generations. If we maintain a sense of identity with our communities and ourselves as Adirondackers, that empowers us to be alert to those kinds of trends, which are absolutely happening now and are only going to become stronger as people value what we have here. We need a sense of coherence and community to withstand these things. And then by protecting the park and protecting the protections, we're also protecting the species that live with us.
Yeah, I was really glad to see you talk about that.
Yeah.
I'll piggyback on that. I think, these are some of these interesting discussions that we kind of, moving outside the realm of science. And, now we're starting to talk about how we go through there. But, the Adirondacks, was kind of formed as a reaction to protect the areas after a large scale devastation happened. The water quality was becoming very poor off of it, large land areas being cut and, wildfires. And so that was a reaction to it. So it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is to, this comes about. Hopefully it encourages people to do similar types of steps. We need to protect more areas. We need to make areas more habitable for people. I mean, we're going to have more people move up into this region. So how are we going to prepare for that? How are we going to be able to make it equitable? These are discussions that we should start to have, and we can think about, this Adirondacks as a refuge, not only for wildlife, but also a refuge for people.
All right. Looks like we just have one more question come in, and if anyone has any more questions, please get them in right away. We're getting toward the end here of our time. Curt, this may be politically incorrect, but I think a lot of the amount of dirty energy required to create power and clean energy, are there any studies about what that balance is today, how to bring it down, and what we can actually achieve?
Yeah, I'd refer you again to Michael Mann's book. And although you could argue that Bill McKibben is, super radical lefty and all that kind of stuff, he does have a lot of facts and figures about this kind of thing. There's a lot of propaganda. Again, this is another targeted thing coming from the fossil fuel industry of saying, don't do wind and solar because batteries require mining and you're going to damage the earth and you got to dispose. This is distraction. Every industry on a large scale has impacts. The bottom line is it's nothing compared to the damage we're doing with the heat trapping gases, and you do mining for them too. So I would not be distracted by that. Certainly, no matter what we do, there are going to be impacts. So don't let that stop us. Put them into perspective there. We absolutely need these. And frankly, just to be completely human-centered here, we have to make this transition for us, because civilization requires huge amounts of energy. And without civilization, most of us are going to die, right? We can't sustain, we can't even get enough phosphorus atoms out of the ground without industry to make our bodies, right? So we got to do this. And we're going to run out of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is delaying just so their stakeholders and their executives can make as much money as they can. And that's what they do. They're like a predator that eats meat, right? So you gotta expect them to do that. But we gotta make this change now rather than under duress in one more lifetime. When we're out of this stuff and civilization starts to collapse, we gotta make this change and figure out how to deal with the pollution from batteries and stuff like that, right? Don't let it stop us, make it pull forward, but don't lose sight. I'll wrap up with my polemic here. I always think of this game, if you ever watch this movie, The Hunger Games, and there was this evil government trying to get the heroes to fight among themselves. And there was one key moment where they kind of trapped the two into just one's about to shoot the other, and the big bad guy is watching in the TV and he says, "Let it fly, Katniss, let it fly." And then the hero raises his arm and says, "Katniss, remember who the real enemy is." And that stops her and she thinks about it. Remember, it's the fossil fuels behind all of this. And there's money trying to stop us from seeing that. That's my big pile of stuff.
And I think the other, way to kind of wrap up and end on is to say that, we have lots of examples of when humans, we work together and do these things, we can find solutions. Phil talked about, once we identified, hey, ballast water was an issue. Well, it wasn't like we're stopping shipping. We're not going to ship anything from Europe anymore. It's like, well, we can use practices and tools and technology where we can greatly reduce that impact, and we're still able to have the shipping. The classic ozone, right here in the Adirondacks, the acid rain, was coming from coal power plants in the Midwest. And it wasn't like we said, well, everybody in the Midwest is going to no more electricity for them. We figured out technological solutions to remove the sulfur dioxide and nitric oxide from so that we don't have to have those negative effects. But it wasn't at the expense of saying nobody in the Midwest can use electricity anymore. So a lot of these arguments, you know, about these kind of trade-offs are kind of these false arguments. And historically, the data shows that, you know, it's generally cheaper and it can generally happen faster than the naysayers do. So, you know, the key example is when we all decide, hey, something is important, you know, we put money behind it, we can figure out the way. So we can be the solution.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really great note to end on. I want to thank Curt Stager and Brian Greene for giving us so much time today. It was excellent. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining and being interested in this important topic. This video, I can actually stop the recording now.